I have money, Corey. I have money you don't know about.
The envelope was still in Corey's hand when Simone got home, and she knew from the doorway, before either of them said a single word, that whatever was inside it had already changed the shape of their evening. "What is that?" she said, not really a question. He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer, and by the time he finally turned it around so she could read the header, a notice of default, 90 days past due, foreclosure proceedings to begin in 30, she was already across the room, already shouting in a voice she didn't fully recognize as her own. "How is this possible, Corey? How is a foreclosure notice sitting in our living room when I have watched you pay this mortgage every single month for 7 years?" He didn't have an answer that held up under the first question, let alone the 10 that followed it. And somewhere in the middle of the shouting, somewhere in the middle of him saying, "I can explain," and her saying, "Then explain," she said something that stopped the whole argument cold, something she'd never once said out loud in 3 years of carrying it alone. "I have money, Corey. I have money you don't know about. And I need you to understand exactly why I never told you I had it." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how two people standing in the same living room could be carrying two completely different secrets about the same marriage, you have to go back 3 years, to the night Simone first noticed something was wrong, and didn't yet have a name for what it was. Simone and Corey had been married 7 years by the time the foreclosure notice arrived, together for 2 years before that. They'd met at a mutual friend's cookout, Simone fresh off a brutal 12-hour shift and still in her scrubs, Corey the one who noticed she hadn't eaten yet and brought her a plate before she'd even asked. She would tell people, in the early years, that this small, unprompted gesture told her most of what she needed to know about him, that he paid attention to the things other people missed, that he took care of people without being asked to. It was a quality she leaned on hard during their first 2 years dating, both of them working long, unpredictable hours, learning to build a relationship in the gaps between shifts and sales calls. She was a labor and delivery nurse, the kind of job that taught her early how to stay calm while everything around her was falling apart, a skill that would end up serving her in rooms far outside any hospital. Corey worked in commercial sales, good at his job in the specific, exhausting way that meant good months and terrible months lived right next to each other on the same calendar, commission checks that swung wide enough to make budgeting feel, some years, like guesswork dressed up as a plan. They'd built a life that looked, from any reasonable distance, entirely stable. A modest 3-bedroom house they'd bought 5 years into the marriage, a shared calendar color-coded for both their shifts, Sunday dinners with his mother every other week, a running joke between them about which one of them would actually remember to water the plants. Simone had never once doubted, in those early years, that they were building something solid. She would tell people, without exaggeration, that Corey was the steadiest person she'd ever dated, which was part of what made the next 3 years so disorienting. Watching steadiness erode in increments so small that no single moment ever felt like the moment to raise an alarm. It started, as far as Simone could ever reconstruct it later, with a work trip to a conference that had a casino floor attached to the hotel. Corey came home from that trip in an unusually good mood, joking about a run of luck at the blackjack table, for $100 up over 2 nights. Money he'd used to buy Simone a bracelet she still wore sometimes without fully being able to look at it the same way. He told the story at dinner that first night home with real animation, describing the dealer, the other players at the table, the exact moment he'd decided to double down on a hand that could easily have gone the other way. Simone laughed along with him, genuinely delighted, teasing him that he'd found a new party trick. She thought nothing of it at the time. People won money at casinos on work trips. It was a story, not a pattern, and she filed it away exactly the way most people file away a pleasant anecdote, without a second thought. The pattern took longer to become visible than either of them, looking back, would have guessed. Corey started finding reasons to go out on weeknights that hadn't existed before, a work happy hour that ran later than usual, a guy's night, with coworkers Simone had met maybe twice, poker games he described in just enough detail to sound ordinary. She noticed, over that first year, that his mood on the mornings after those nights swung wider than seemed proportionate to a card game among friends, sometimes electric and talkative in a way that felt performed, sometimes flat and irritable in a way he blamed on being tired. She asked him once, gently, if everything was okay. He said work stress, and she believed him, because there was no obvious reason not to. The first real crack in the story came about a year and a half in, when Simone noticed a credit card statement left open on the dining table. Not hidden, just careless, the way most secrets eventually slip before the person carrying them tightens their grip again. A charge from an online sports book, $200, sitting between a gas station charge and a grocery run like it belonged there. "What's this?" she asked, sliding the statement across to him at dinner that night. No accusation in her voice yet, genuinely curious rather than suspicious. "Oh, that," he said, barely glancing at it. "Marcus from work got me into one of those fantasy football things with real money on the line. It's nothing, just a fun way to watch the games. $200 is nothing. It's a one-time buy-in," he said, already reaching for the remote, already changing the subject to something about her shift the next day. "I'll probably stop once the season's over anyway." She let it go. Football season ended. The charges didn't. What Simone couldn't have known yet, standing at that dining table with a credit card statement in her hand, was that Corey himself didn't fully understand what was happening to him either, not in those early months. He would tell her, years later, that the first big win, nearly $3,000 on a single parlay bet, 6 months into the sports betting, had done something to his brain he still didn't have good language for, a rush that made the steady, unglamorous discipline of his actual paycheck feel almost beside the point. He told himself, that first year, that he was simply good at this the way he was good at reading a sales floor, that the losses were just the cost of learning a new skill, that the next win would even everything back out. It never occurred to him, not for a long time, that the math itself was built to make sure it never would. Simone's own turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday in the second year of the pattern, when she went to transfer money from their joint savings account to cover an unexpected car repair and found the balance nearly $4,000 lower than she remembered it being. She didn't say anything to Corey that night. She sat at the small desk in the spare room she used as a home office after he'd gone to bed, pulling up bank statements on her laptop, cross-referencing dates and amounts with a methodical calm that felt, to her, like the same instinct that kicked in during a difficult delivery, the part of her brain that stopped feeling the fear and simply started solving the problem in front of her. What she found that night didn't yet add up to the full scope of what was actually happening, but it added up to enough. A pattern of withdrawals, small and then not so small, timed suspiciously close to weekends and the occasional Tuesday or Wednesday night Corey had described as guys' night. She didn't confront him with a full accusation. She wasn't ready for the fight that would come with that, and some instinct, sharper than she could fully explain even to herself, told her that confronting him head-on before she understood the size of the problem would only push whatever this was further underground. Instead, she did something she never told him about. Not for 3 full years. She opened a savings account at a different bank across town, one that sent no paper statements to the house and no notifications to any device Corey might see over her shoulder. She started routing a portion of every paycheck into it. Not a dramatic amount at first, just enough that she wouldn't feel it in the monthly budget, an old habit from nursing school when she'd learned to live on very little and save what she could regardless of how little that was. She told herself, in those first weeks, that she was simply being prudent, building a cushion the way any responsible person might. She didn't yet let herself say out loud, even internally, the deeper reason underneath the prudence, that some part of her had already started preparing for a version of their life together that might not hold. Over the following months, Simone picked up extra shifts at the hospital, framing them to Corey as covering for co-workers going through their own hard stretches, which wasn't entirely a lie. Hospitals always needed the coverage, and she was genuinely helping people by taking the shifts. What she didn't mention was that she was seeking them out deliberately, stacking overtime hours on top of her regular schedule, funneling nearly all of that extra income straight into the account Corey didn't know existed. The side business came about almost by accident. She'd started sewing small blankets for the newborns on her unit during a particularly brutal stretch of night shifts, a way of keeping her hands busy during the rare quiet stretches between deliveries, and one of the other nurses had asked, half joking, whether Simone sold them anywhere. She didn't, not yet, but the question stuck with her, and within a few weeks, she'd opened a small online shop almost on a whim, listing a handful of blankets and simple nursery decor pieces she'd made in her spare evenings. The first sale, to a stranger 3 states away, felt disproportionately thrilling for a $22 blanket, and within a year, what had started as a creative outlet had grown into a second, modest stream of income that she kept almost entirely separate from their shared finances, routing nearly every dollar of it into the same account as her overtime pay. She never told Corey the shop was making real money. When he asked about it, which he rarely did, she described it the way she'd always described it: a fun hobby, a little extra pocket money, nothing worth discussing in detail. He had no reason to press further, distracted as he increasingly was by his own parallel secret. And the two of them moved through those years like two people quietly building separate rooms onto the same house, neither one fully aware of what the other was constructing on the other side of the wall. She never framed any of this to herself as leaving him. She would have told you, honestly, in year 2 of doing this, that she still loved Corey, still believed in the marriage, still hoped whatever was happening with him would resolve itself before it became something neither of them could recover from. But she had also learned, over 3 years of nursing shifts that put her in rooms with families experiencing the worst days of their lives, that hope was not a plan, and that the people who came through hard situations with any stability intact were almost always the ones who had quietly prepared for more than one outcome before they needed to. Corey's gambling, meanwhile, followed the trajectory that gambling addiction almost always follows once it takes hold: an escalating need for larger stakes to chase the same feeling the smaller wins used to provide, a growing sophistication in hiding the evidence, a private, increasingly desperate belief that one more big win would fix everything the previous losses had broken. By the middle of the second year, he had taken out a personal loan he told Simone was for a work-related expense, quietly funneling the entire amount into an online casino account within 6 weeks. By the start of the third year, he had opened a home equity line of credit, forging enough of the paperwork trail to keep it hidden from Simone for months, telling himself, with the particular self-deception addiction specializes in, that he was simply borrowing against an asset he fully intended to pay back before she ever needed to know. He wasn't a cruel man, and he wasn't, by nature, a liar. Friends and family who knew him would have described him, accurately, as generous and easygoing, someone who remembered birthdays and showed up for people. What had happened to him lived somewhere separate from his character, in the part of the brain that gambling addiction specifically and viciously hijacks, and by the third year, the lying had become so load-bearing to his daily functioning that he'd stopped fully registering it as lying at all. It had become simply the mechanism by which he got through each day without the whole structure collapsing before he was ready to face it. The home equity line of credit was the beginning of the end of what little margin they had left. Corey lost most of it within 4 months, chasing losses with larger and larger bets in the particular, familiar downward pattern that anyone who has watched gambling addiction up close would recognize immediately. By the time he'd exhausted that line of credit, he had also fallen behind on the actual mortgage payment 3 separate times, covering the gaps with cash advances on credit cards that carried interest rates high enough to make the hole deeper every month rather than smaller. He told Simone, each time she asked about their finances feeling tighter than usual, some version of a story about a slow quarter at work, commission structures changing, temporary belt tightening that would resolve itself soon. She believed him less each time, though she never said so directly, continuing instead to quietly grow the account he didn't know about, now approaching a size that surprised even her when she checked the balance late at night. The foreclosure notice that arrived on the day the argument began was not, as it turned out, the first warning the bank had sent. Corey had intercepted 2 previous letters over the preceding months, opening the mail before Simone got home from her shifts, disposing of anything that might reveal what was actually happening to their mortgage. The final notice arrived on a day he happened to be running late from a client meeting, and Simone, checking the mailbox on her way in from a 12-hour shift, found it before he had the chance to make it disappear like the others. She stood on the porch reading it twice before she fully believed what she was looking at, feeling something drop through the floor of her stomach that she recognized, distantly, as the same sensation she'd felt 2 years earlier finding that first strange credit card charge. Except now, standing here, she understood in one devastating instant just how much bigger the iceberg beneath that original small, strange charge had actually grown while she wasn't looking directly at it. She was still standing in the living room with the notice in her hand when Corey walked in 20 minutes later, and the argument that followed was, by both their later accounts, the loudest either of them had ever been in 7 years of marriage. Corey tried, in the first few minutes, to offer some version of the story he'd been offering for years, a rough patch, a temporary setback, something he had under control. Simone, holding the actual, undeniable document in her hand, wasn't willing to accept a vague explanation this time, and pressed him, sentence by sentence, until the full shape of it finally came out. The home equity line, the personal loan, the sports betting that had started as a work trip anecdote and grown into something that had quietly eaten their entire financial foundation out from underneath them. Corey, cornered and exposed in a way he had spent 3 years actively engineering his life to avoid, didn't try to minimize it any further once the full truth was finally sitting between them. He told her everything, voice cracking in a way she'd never heard from him before, the details spilling out faster than either of them could fully process. The amounts, the timeline, the sports betting apps, the 2 intercepted foreclosure notices, the shame that had kept him lying for so long precisely because each individual lie had felt, at the time, smaller and more survivable than the truth underneath all of them combined. It was somewhere in the middle of his confession, watching him fall apart on their own living room couch over a hole he'd dug that neither of them could see the bottom of, that Simone said the thing she'd carried alone for 3 years. She told him about the account. She told him the rough total, enough, as it turned out, to cover the mortgage arrears in full, with room left over, and watched something complicated move across his face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite shame, but some difficult combination of both at once. Understanding in real time that his wife had spent 3 years quietly building a floor beneath them, while he was busy tearing the floor out from underneath the version of their life he thought they were still standing on. Together, Corey asked her, once the shouting had fully burned itself out and they were both sitting at the table in a kind of exhausted, wrung-out silence, why she'd never told him. Simone thought about that question longer than she thought about almost anything else in the conversation, because the honest answer wasn't simple. She told him it wasn't about hiding money from him the way he'd hidden losses from her. It was that some instinct, sharpened by years of nursing work and by watching him slowly become someone she couldn't fully predict anymore, had told her she needed a version of stability that didn't depend on his choices, whatever those choices turned out to be. She told him she hadn't built the account to leave him. She'd built it so that whatever happened next, she wouldn't be standing in the wreckage with nothing of her own to stand on. Corey's mother found out about all of it 2 weeks later, when Corey, unable to keep carrying the weight of it alone any longer, finally told her himself over the phone. She'd always been fond of Simone, close to her in the easy, uncomplicated way mothers-in-law sometimes are when they sense their child has found someone steadier than they are, and her first reaction, once the shock passed, was to call Simone directly and thank her, not for staying, which she was careful not to assume, but for the 3 years of quiet discipline that had kept the family from losing the house entirely. "I don't know how you carried that alone," she told Simone, voice thick over the phone. Simone didn't have a clean answer for her either, only that she hadn't felt like she had another option that made sense at the time. Their bi-weekly Sunday dinners paused for nearly 2 months after that call, an unspoken agreement that the family needed space before anyone sat across a table from each other again. When they finally resumed, quietly and without ceremony, Corey's mother made a point of setting a place for Simone before anyone else's, a small gesture that Simone understood, without either of them saying anything about it directly, as its own kind of acknowledgement of everything the past 2 months had cost and everything it had also, somehow, managed to hold together. The weeks that followed the argument were some of the hardest either of them had lived through, harder in some ways than the argument itself, because the argument at least had the release of finally saying things out loud after years of silence. What came after was slower and more grinding. Corey enrolling in a gambling addiction program the following week, sessions 3 times a week at first, Simone driving him to the early ones because he was too ashamed to be seen walking in alone. She remembered sitting in the parking lot outside the community center where his first session was held, watching him stand frozen by the entrance for nearly 5 full minutes before he could make himself walk through the door. She hadn't gone in with him. The program was his to do, not hers to manage. but she'd waited in that parking lot the entire 90 minutes anyway, unwilling to leave him to drive home alone from something that hard on his very first try. He came out that first night quieter than she'd seen him in years, not defeated exactly, but stripped down to something rawer and more honest than the version of himself he'd been performing for 3 years straight. He didn't say much on the drive home. She didn't push him to. He surrendered access to their remaining accounts voluntarily, asked her to hold the passwords, understanding without being told that trust, once broken this completely, had to be rebuilt through actions rather than promises. Simone used a portion of her secret savings to bring the mortgage current, a decision she didn't make lightly and didn't make immediately. She took nearly 2 weeks, sitting with the question of whether saving the house was even the right call, whether staying in the marriage at all was the right call, before deciding, carefully and with eyes fully open about what she was choosing, to give Corey one real chance at recovery. She was explicit with him, in a conversation that lasted most of one difficult Saturday, that this wasn't a blank check, financial or emotional, that the money covering the mortgage was a bridge, not a bailout, and that what happened next depended entirely on whether he did the actual, unglamorous work of recovery rather than simply promising he would. Corey did the work. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't clean. There was one relapse 8 months in, a $200 bet placed during a stretch of work stress that hit right as a big client deal fell through. He told Simone about it himself, unprompted, less than a day after it happened, sitting her down on the couch with the same rawness he'd carried out of that first meeting 8 months earlier. "I placed a bet yesterday," he said, before she'd even set her bag down. $200. I lost it. I'm telling you because I promised I would, and because if I don't say it out loud right now, I'm scared of what I'll let myself believe about it by tomorrow. She sat with that for a long moment, feeling an old, familiar fear rise up in her chest, before she recognized what was actually different this time. Not the relapse itself, which she'd been warned by his counselor to expect as a real possibility, but the 24 hours between it happening and him telling her, instead of the old pattern of months or years. It was, paradoxically, one of the moments that did the most to rebuild her trust in him, because it proved he was finally choosing honesty over the old instinct to bury anything uncomfortable until it grew too large to hide. He stayed in the program for 18 months total, moved to a monthly check-in after the first year, and slowly, unglamorously, rebuilt a version of financial transparency with Simone that neither of them had ever practiced even before any of this started. Shared logins, a joint monthly review of every account. A marriage counselor they saw together for the better part of a year, working through not just the gambling itself, but the 3 years of separate, parallel secret-keeping that had let it grow as large as it did before either of them said a word out loud. Simone never fully closed the separate account, though she did eventually tell Corey exactly how much was in it, and stopped hiding new deposits from him, folding what had once been a secret into something closer to an emergency fund they both knew about and both, eventually, contributed to. She kept the small side business too, though it had grown enough by then that it stopped being a secret hobby and became, openly, a second income stream they factored into their actual household budget. A strange, quiet gift, in the end, from the very years that had almost cost them everything. She would say, if you asked her years later, that she didn't regret keeping it hidden during those 3 hard years, even once the marriage was healthy again, that the account had never really been about distrust of Corey, specifically so much as a hard-won understanding that she needed, always, to be someone who could stand on her own regardless of what happened around her. She'd learned that lesson first on the labor and delivery floor, watching families walk into the hardest nights of their lives without any plan for what came next, and she'd simply, quietly, applied the same instinct to her own marriage once she sensed the ground shifting beneath it. If you asked Corey the same question, he'd tell you something harder to say out loud, that finding out about the account, in the worst moment of his life, had somehow been one of the only things that kept him from feeling completely destroyed by what he'd done. She hadn't just survived his 3 years of lying. She had, without his knowledge and without his help, quietly built something solid enough to catch them both when everything else gave way. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to psycheTalesTv for more stories about the quiet strength people build when they need it most. And tell us in the comments whether you think Simone made the right call keeping that account a secret for as long as she did. Before you go, Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.